Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe. Your support is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. I always knew the legend of the Amityville house. It was one of those stories everyone had heard of, a chilling tale of unimaginable horror that gripped the small town of Amityville, New York. The house on 112 Ocean Avenue had become infamous after the DeFeo family was brutally murdered there in 1974, followed by the Lutz family, who claimed to experience terrifying paranormal activity after moving in. But like most people, I chalked it up to urban legend, just another ghost story to scare kids and thrill seekers. That was until I found myself face to face with the curse of the Amityville house. I had just started working as a real estate photographer, a gig that had me traveling all over the Northeast, photographing everything from cozy cottages to sprawling estates. When my boss told me we had a job in Amityville, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't until I pulled up to the house that I realized exactly where I was. The house stood there like a brooding sentinel, its iconic eye-like windows staring down at me as I parked my car. A shiver ran down my spine, but I shook it off. After all, it was just a house, right? The agent who hired me was already inside, unlocking the doors and windows to let in some light. "We'll be quick," she said, her voice tight. "The sooner we're out of here, the better." I nodded, not wanting to admit that I was already feeling uneasy. As I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell, stale and musty, like the house had been sealed up for decades. The air was thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. I tried to focus on my work, snapping photos of the empty rooms, but something about the place made it impossible to concentrate. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls, set my nerves on edge. I felt like I was being watched, like there was something just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling only grew stronger the longer I stayed in the house. At one point, while photographing the living room, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, expecting to see the agent, but the room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen, scanning the room for any sign of what I had seen. But there was nothing there, just empty air and silence. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me like a wet blanket. The agent must have sensed it, too, because she hurried me through the rest of the house, her eyes darting nervously around as we moved from room to room. When we finally finished, she practically bolted for the door, leaving me to lock up. I was alone in the house for maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. Every second I spent there, the air grew heavier, the shadows darker. By the time I locked the door and stepped outside, I was drenched in sweat, my hands shaking. I didn't say anything to the agent as we drove away, but I could tell she was just as rattled as I was. The rest of the day passed in a blur, and by the time I got home, I had convinced myself that it was just the power of suggestion, that the house wasn't really haunted. I had just let the stories get to me. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My dreams were filled with dark, twisted images, blood-soaked walls, shadowy figures lurking just out of reach, and that house, always that house, looming over me like a dark cloud. When I woke up the next morning, I felt exhausted, like I hadn't slept at all. I tried to go about my day as usual, but I couldn't focus. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the house. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards in my apartment set my heart racing. By the end of the day, I was a wreck. I decided to go back through the photos I had taken at the house, hoping that maybe focusing on my work would help me shake the feeling of dread that had been hanging over me. But as I clicked through the images, my heart sank. In almost every photo, there was something there that shouldn't have been. A shadowy figure in the corner of a room, a dark shape hovering near the ceiling, faint outlines of faces in the windows. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but the more I looked, the more certain I became that something or someone was in those photos with me. I showed them to a few friends, but no one could explain what they were seeing. Some of them thought it was just a camera glitch, but deep down I knew better. Whatever was in that house had followed me home, and it wasn't going to let me go. Over the next few days, the activity in my apartment escalated. Lights would flicker on and off, objects would move on their own, and strange noises would echo through the rooms at all hours of the night. I started waking up with scratches and bruises that I couldn't explain, and I felt like I was being watched constantly. No matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was with me, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Desperate for answers, I reached out to a paranormal investigator I had met while working on a different job. He agreed to come to my apartment and see if he could figure out what was going on. The moment he stepped through the door, his face went pale. "You brought something back with you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Something dark. He set up his equipment, and within minutes he was picking up strange redding spikes in electromagnetic energy, and explained cold spots and faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. We spent hours trying to communicate with whatever was haunting me, but it refused to respond directly. All we got were vague, cryptic messages, flashes of static on the audio recorder, brief bursts of movement on the video cameras, and a growing sense of dread that seemed to hang over everything like a thick fog. By the time the investigator left, I felt more unsettled than ever. Whatever was haunting me wasn't just a ghost, it was something far more sinister. In the weeks that followed, the activity in my apartment only grew worse. I started seeing dark figures out of the corner of my, hearing voices that weren't there, and waking up in the middle of the night to find shadowy figures standing at the foot of my bed. I tried everything to get rid of its sage smudging, salt lines, even calling in a priest to bless the apartment, but nothing worked. Whatever I had brought back from the Amityville house had latched onto me, and it wasn't going to let go. It's been months now since I visited that cursed house, and I still feel its presence with me every day. The activity has died down somewhat, but I know it's still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I've considered moving, starting fresh somewhere far away from Amityville, but I know deep down that it wouldn't make a difference. Whatever I unleashed that day is bound to me now, and no matter where I go, it will follow. The curse of the Amityville house isn't just a story, it's real, and it's far more terrifying than anything I ever could have imagined. The night shift had always been my favorite. Fewer passengers meant more peace, and the city at night had a calming effect on me. I've been a taxi driver for over 10 years, and during that time I've seen and heard it all, from late-night confessions to drunken rants. Nothing surprised me anymore. But that night something happened that I will never forget. It was a little past midnight when I picked up a call from the dispatch. A passenger needed a ride from the outskirts of town to the city center. The address was unfamiliar, somewhere near the old industrial district, a place that had been largely abandoned for years. I hesitated for a moment, but decided to take the ride. The fare was good, and I needed the money. The drive to the pickup location was uneventful, but as I got closer, the streets grew darker, the buildings more dilapidated. The old factories loomed like skeletons against the night sky, their windows shattered, and their walls covered in graffiti. The GPS led me to a narrow, winding road that seemed to lead nowhere. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. Waving, I pulled over and rolled down the window. The passenger was a woman in her late 20s, dressed in a long coat that seemed too heavy for the mild night. She had pale skin, dark circles under her eyes, and a somber expression that made me uneasy. "Are you the one who called for a taxi?" I asked. She nodded silently and got into the back seat. I glanced at her through the rearview mirror, but she avoided eye contact, staring out the window instead. Something about her felt off, but I shrugged it off and started driving. The road was deserted, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. I tried making small talk, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery. After a while, I gave up and focused on the road ahead. The ride was long, and the route she requested took us through some of the most isolated parts of the city. As we passed an old bridge, I felt a sudden chill in the air. It was as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. I glanced at the rearview mirror again and noticed that the woman was no longer sitting in the back seat. I slammed on the brakes and turned around, but the back seat was empty. My heart raced as I checked the doors and windows, all of which were still locked. There was no way she could have gotten out. Panic set in as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I looked around, hoping to spot her somewhere on the road, but there was no sign of her. Just as I was about to call the dispatch, I heard a soft voice from the back seat. "Why did you stop?" I whipped around, and there she was, sitting in the back seat as if she had never left. Her eyes were fixed on me, her expression blank. I thought you got out," I stammered, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. She shook her head slowly, her gaze never leaving mine. "Just keep driving," she said, her voice cold and distant. I did as she said, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be happening. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. The rest of the drive was a blur. I kept my eyes on the road, afraid to look at her again. The silence in the car was suffocating, and the air grew colder with each passing minute. Finally, we reached the destination she had given me, a rundown apartment building on the edge of the city. I pulled over and turned to tell her we had arrived, but the back seat was empty once again. This time I didn't stop to check. I floored the gas pedal and sped away from the building, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally felt safe enough to pull over, I called the dispatch and told them what had happened. They checked the records, but there was no trace of the call or the address I had been given. It was as if the whole ride had never happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just experienced something supernatural, something beyond explanation. For weeks, I avoided taking night shifts, the memory of that night haunting me every time I got behind the wheel. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget her face the way she had disappeared and reappeared as if she were never really there. And then, one night, it happened again. I was driving through a different part of the city when I received another call from the dispatch. The address was unfamiliar, but the route seemed straightforward. As I approached the pickup location, I saw her again, standing by the side of the road, waving. My blood ran cold as I realized it was the same woman. wearing the same coat, with the same somber expression. I froze, unable to move, my mind screaming at me to drive away. But before I could react, she was in the back seat again, silent and staring out the window. "Drive," she said, her voice as cold as the night air. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I drove in a daze, my mind numb with fear. When we reached the destination, she was gone again, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the lingering chill in the air. After that, I quit my job as a taxi driver. I couldn't bear the thought of picking up another passenger, not knowing if they were real or something else entirely. To this day, I still wonder who she was or what she was. Was she a ghost, a spirit trapped in some eternal loop, reliving the same ride over and over again? Or was she something else, something darker, something that feeds on the fear of those who encounter her? I don't know, and I don't think I ever will. But one thing is certain, I will never forget that haunting ride, and I will never drive a taxi at night again. The Michigan wilderness is vast, stretching out into seemingly endless forests and lakes that seem to go on forever. I've always been drawn to these wild and tame places where the only sounds are the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. That's why every year I take a week off work and head out into the wilderness with nothing but a backpack and a tent, seeking the peace and solitude that only nature can provide. This time I decided to explore a new area, a remote section of forest near the Manistee National Forest, a place I had heard about from fellow hikers, but had never visited myself. The area was said to be beautiful, with dense woods, clear streams, and wildlife in abundance. It was also said to be eerily quiet, with few visitors and even fewer signs of civilization. That's exactly what I was looking for. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was cool and crisp, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs as I set off down the trail. It was everything I had hoped for: untouched wilderness as far as the eye could see, with no sign of human presence. The first few days were uneventful, just me and the forest, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I set up camp each night in a different spot, always careful to leave no trace of my presence, just as I had been taught. The wilderness was my home, and I treated it with the respect it deserved. But on the fourth night, something changed. I had set up camp near a small stream, the sound of the water soothing as I settled in for the night. The fire crackled softly, the warmth of the flames a welcome comfort against the cool night air. I had just finished my dinner and was preparing to turn in when I heard a low, rumbling growl that sent a shiver down my spine. At first, I thought it was a bear. The area was known for its black bears, and I had taken the necessary precautions, storing my food in a bear-proof container and setting up camp away from any known bear paths. But as the growl grew louder, closer, I realized this was no bear. The sound was deeper, more menacing, like something from a nightmare. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the darkness, the beam cutting through the trees as I tried to locate the source of the noise. The forest was still, the only sound the growling that seemed to echo from all around me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. And then I saw it at the edge of the firelight, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, stood a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, reflecting the fire as they stared at me with an intensity that sent a wave of terror through me. The creature's head was that of a wolf, but its body was humanoid, with long, muscular limbs and claws that gleamed in the darkness. For a moment I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think. The creature's growls grew louder, more aggressive, as it took a step toward me, its claws digging into the earth. I knew I had to do something, but my body refused to respond, my mind overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing. And then, just as the creature seemed ready to pounce, I snapped out of my trance. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a burning log from the fire, and held it out in front of me like a makeshift weapon. The creature hesitated, its eyes narrowing as it studied me, as if deciding whether or not I was worth the effort. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, my hands trembling as I held the burning log out in front of me. The creature took another step forward, its growls growing softer, more measured, as if it was testing me, trying to gauge my reaction. And then, without warning, it turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. I stood there, stunned, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The growling faded into the distance, leaving behind only the crackling of the fire and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my heart racing, my mind conjuring images of the creature lurking just beyond the firelight, waiting for its chance to strike. I sat by the fire, clutching the burning log like a lifeline, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. When morning finally came, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, my hands still shaking as I stuffed my gear into my backpack. I knew I couldn't stay there, not after what had happened. The wilderness, once my sanctuary, had become a place of terror, and I needed to get out. I hiked back to the trailhead in record time, my eyes constantly scanning the trees for any sign of the creature. But the forest was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I reached my cart just as the sun was beginning to set, the long shadows of the trees stretching across the ground like dark fingers. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the creature was still out there, hidden among the trees, its glowing eyes tracking my every move. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the forest, the weight of the encounter pressing down on me like a physical burden. Even now, weeks later, I can't get the image of the creature out of my mind. Its glowing eyes, its hulking form, the way it moved with a predatory grace that sent chills down my spine. I've tried to rationalize what I saw, to tell myself it was just a bear, or maybe a wolf, but I know better. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't something of this world. I haven't been back to the Michigan wilderness since that night. The thought of setting foot in those woods again fills me with a deep, primal fear that I can't shake. I've always loved the wilderness, but now I'm not so sure. There are things out there, things we don't understand, things that defy explanation, and whatever that creature was, I know one thing for certain: it's still out there, waiting, watching, and I'll never forget the night I came face to face with it. It started as a dare. My friends and I were always looking for new thrills, and the abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town seemed like the perfect place to test our courage. It had been closed for decades, left to rot after a series of mysterious deaths and rumors of unethical experiments. The locals said the place was cursed, haunted by the souls of those who had suffered there. We laughed it off, convinced that it was just another urban legend meant to scare off curious kids like us. That's how we found ourselves standing in front of the rusted gates one chilly autumn evening, armed with nothing but flashlights and bravado. There were four of us, me, Jake, Lisa, and Eric. We had been friends since childhood, always looking for the next big adventure. The asylum loomed before us, its windows shattered and its walls covered in ivy. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the wind howled through the broken glass, creating an eerie symphony that sent shivers down my spine. "Ready?" Jake asked, his voice barely masking the nervousness that we all felt. "Let's do this," I replied, trying to sound confident. We pushed open the gates, which creaked ominously in protest, and made our way inside. The courtyard was overgrown with weeds, and the once grand entrance was now a crumbling ruin. We shone our flashlights around, illuminating the cracked walls and peeling paint. The place felt wrong, as if the very air was thick with the memories of the past. "This is so creepy," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "It's just an old building," Eric said, though his voice lacked conviction. We reached the main entrance, where the heavy wooden doors hung off their hinges. Pushing them open, we stepped into the lobby. The floor was covered in debris, and the walls were stained with water damage. The place was eerily silent, save for the occasional drip of water echoing through the halls. "Let's split up," Jake suggested. "We'll cover more ground that way." I didn't like the idea, but I didn't want to be the one to chicken out. We divided into pairs. Jake and Lisa went to explore the east wing, while Eric and I took the west. As we walked down the dark corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadows seemed to shift and move in the corners of my vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. "This place gives me the creeps," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, but it's kinda cool too, right?" Eric replied, trying to sound enthusiastic. We reached a large room that had once been a common area. The furniture was overturned, and the walls were covered in strange symbols that looked like they had been scratched into the paint. "What do you think those mean?" Eric asked, shining his flashlight on the symbols. "I have no idea, but I don't like it," I replied, a sense of unease growing in the pit of my stomach. We moved on, exploring the various rooms and hallways, each one more unsettling than the last. The building was a maze of corridors and staircases, some leading to nowhere, others to locked doors or collapsed floors. The further we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the very walls were closing in on us. We found ourselves in what appeared to be the old patient wards. The doors to the rooms were open, revealing rows of rusted metal beds, their mattresses torn and stained. The smell of mildew and rot was overwhelming, and the air was thick with the weight of untold suffering. "This place is seriously messed up," Eric muttered, his bravado gone. "Let's just find the others and get out of here." We turned to head back, but the corridor we had come down now seemed unfamiliar, as if the building had shifted and changed while we weren't looking. Panic set in as we realized we were lost. We tried to retrace our steps, but every turn led us deeper into the labyrinth of the asylum. The walls seemed to close in, the corridors growing narrower and darker with each step. The silence was broken only by the sound of our breathing and the occasional creak of the floorboards under our feet. "Where the hell are we?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I don't know," Eric replied, his face pale, "but we need to keep moving. We'll find our way out eventually." We continued down the corridor, our flashlights flickering as if the batteries were dying. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. Then, without warning, the lights went out. We were plunged into darkness, and I felt a surge of panic. "Eric," I called out, but there was no response. I fumbled for my flashlight, trying to get it to work, but it was dead. I was alone, lost in the dark, with no idea where I was or how to get out. My heart raced as I felt my way along the wall, hoping to find a door or window, anything that would lead me to safety. But the walls seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness swallowing me whole. Then I heard it, a soft, distant whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. It was unintelligible, but it sent chills down my spine. I froze, straining to listen, but the whispering stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I was about to move again when I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there, just the endless darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I knew I had to run. I took off down the corridor, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps followed, relentless and unyielding. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I had to get away. I turned corners, ran downstairs, and stumbled through debris, but the footsteps never faltered. They were right behind me, getting closer and closer. I was gasping for breath, my legs burning from the effort, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. Then I saw a faint light at the end of the corridor. I pushed myself harder, sprinting towards it with everything I had. As I got closer, I realized it was coming from an open door, the exit to the asylum. I burst through the door and into the cold night air. Collapsing on the ground outside, the footsteps stopped. I looked back at the building, expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing, just the silent, looming structure of the asylum, its windows dark and empty. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, I got up and started walking, my legs shaky, but determined to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I made it back to the car, where I found Jake, Lisa, and Eric waiting for me. They were pale, shaken, and covered in dirt, but they were alive. We didn't say much as we drove back to town, each of us lost in our own thoughts. None of us wanted to talk about what we had experienced, the things we had seen or heard. But I knew, deep down, that we had all been touched by something in that asylum, something that we would never fully understand or be able to explain. We made a pact that night, never to speak of the asylum again, never to return, and never to tell anyone what had happened. We all kept that promise, but the memories lingered, haunting us in our dreams, in the quiet moments when we were alone. I still think about that night sometimes, wondering what it was that we encountered in that place. Was it the spirits of the patients who had suffered there? Was it something darker, something that fed on fear and madness? I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that I will never set foot in that asylum again, and I will never forget the terror that I felt in those dark, twisted halls. It was the kind of house you'd expect to see in a horror movie, old and worn down, sitting on the edge of a forgotten road in the middle of nowhere. But it was my uncle's house, and when he passed away, it became mine. It wasn't much to look at, but it had history of family home that had seen generations grow up, grow old, and eventually leave. I wasn't thrilled about moving in, but the price was right, and I needed a change. I arrived at the farmhouse late one afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields that surrounded the property. The house looked even more forlorn in the fading light, its once white paint now dull gray, the windows dusty and cracked. But there was something about it, a quiet charm that called to me, and I felt a strange sense of connection as I stepped inside for the first time. The interior was just as I had expected, faded wallpaper peeling from the walls, creaky wooden floors, and furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. There was a musty smell in the air, the kind that lingers in old houses, a mix of dust, age, and memories. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me, and set about cleaning up the place. The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking and fixing things up, trying to make the old farmhouse feel like home. But as the sun began to set each evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house seemed to come alive at night. The creaks and groans of the old wood growing louder, more pronounced, as if the very walls were breathing. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on a door. It was so soft at first that I thought I was imagining it, but then it grew louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, my heart racing as I listened, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from downstairs. Near the front door, I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way down the creaky stairs, each step echoing through the silent house. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, as if someone was standing just outside, knocking on the door. My mind raced with possibilities: an animal, the wind, maybe even a neighbor who would come by to check on me. But when I reached the front door and opened it, there was nothing, no one there, no sign of anything that could have made the sound. I stepped outside, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but the night was still, the only sound the rustling of the wind through the trees. I told myself it was just the house settling, the old wood creaking in the night, and went back to bed, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had taken root in my chest. The next night, the tapping returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't coming from the front door, it was coming from inside the house. I lay in bed, frozen in fear, as the tapping grew louder, closer, as if it was moving through the house, making its way toward my bedroom. My mind raced with thoughts of intruders, ghosts, and things that go bump in the night. I knew I had to check it out, but every fiber of my being was screaming at me to stay in bed, to pull the covers over my head and pretend it wasn't happening. But I couldn't ignore it. The sound was getting closer, louder, more insistent. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly opened the door to my bedroom, shining the beam into the hallway. The house was quiet, the tapping now gone, as if it had never been there. I slowly made my way down the hallway, checking each room as I went, but everything was just as I had left it. The unease grew stronger, a sense of dread that made my skin crawl, but I couldn't find anything out of place. I eventually convinced myself that it was just my imagination, the old house playing tricks on me, and went back to bed, but the tapping didn't stop. Every night it returned, growing louder and more aggressive, until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in on me. I started sleeping with the lights on, the flashlight clutched in my hand, but it didn't help. The tapping would start as soon as the sun went down, relentless and unyielding, as if something or someone was trying to get inside. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I was exhausted, on edge, and fed up with the constant noise. I decided to stay up all night, waiting for the tapping to start, determined to catch whatever was causing it. I sat in the living room, the lights on, my eyes glued to the front door, the flashlight in my lap. At first, everything was quiet, the house seemingly at peace. But then, just as the clock struck midnight, the tapping began. It started softly, just like before, a faint knock on the walls. I gripped the flashlight tightly, my heart racing as the sound grew louder, closer, moving through the house. I was ready, waiting, determined to confront whatever was causing it. But when the tapping reached the living room, it stopped. The silence was deafening. the tension so thick I could feel it pressing down on me. I slowly stood up, the flashlight shaking in my hand, and began to search the room, but there was nothing, no sign of anything that could have made the noise, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow, moving across the wall, something tall and thin, with long, spindly fingers. I whipped around, shining the flashlight into the corner where the shadow had been, but there was nothing there. My heart pounded in my chest as I frantically searched the room, but I was alone. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The tapping had stopped, but the unease was stronger than ever, a sense of dread that made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid to close my eyes, too terrified of what might be waiting for me in the darkness. The next morning, I made up my mind I couldn't stay in that house any longer. Whatever was happening, it wasn't normal, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it was. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, throwing them into my car with trembling hands, the fear still gnawing at my insides. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something strange. The front door, the one I had checked so many times, the one that had always been locked, was wide open. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it, my mind racing with possibilities. Had I left it open by mistake? Had someone or something opened it during the night? I didn't stick around to find out. I jumped into my car and drove away as fast as I could, the old farmhouse shrinking in the rearview mirror. As I drove, the unease began to fade, replaced by a sense of relief that I was finally free of that place. But even now, as I sit in my new apartment, far away from the old farmhouse, I can't shake the feeling that I am being watched. Every creak, every rustle of the wind sends a chill down my spine, and I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure standing behind me. I don't know what was in that house, or why it chose to torment me, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never go back. The old farmhouse may be gone, but the fear, the dread, the sense of something lurking just out of sight will stay with me forever. The idea had been simple enough, a weekend camping trip to escape the stress of everyday life. My friends and I had all been feeling the weight of work, school, and relationships, and a few days in the wilderness seemed like the perfect remedy. We chose a remote spot deep in the forest, far from the usual campsites and hiking trails, where we could truly disconnect and enjoy nature's solitude. There were 5 of us: me, Jordan, Emily, Sarah, and Alex. We had been friends since college, our bond forged over countless late-night study sessions, road trips, and shared experiences. This trip was meant to be a chance to reconnect, to laugh around the campfire, and to enjoy each other's company without the distractions of modern life. We loaded up the car with tents, sleeping bags, food, and all the essentials, and set off early on a Friday morning. The drive took us several hours, the road winding through dense forests and towering mountains. By the time we reached the dirt path that led to our chosen campsite, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. We parked the car at the trailhead and hiked the last mile to the campsite, our backs heavy on our backs. The forest was thick and lush, the air filled with the scent of pine and earth. As we walked, the light filtering through the trees grew dimmer, and the sounds of birds and insects filled the silence. The spot we had chosen was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a stream running nearby. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and soon had a roaring fire going. The flames danced in the growing darkness, casting flickering light on our faces as we settled around the campfire. We cooked dinner, told stories, and laughed until our sides hurt. It felt good to be away from the city, to be surrounded by nature and the warmth of friendship. As the night wore on, the conversation turned to ghost stories. It was inevitable. Really, what camping trip would be complete without a few spooky tales? Jordan, always the storyteller of the group, began with a tale about a haunted cabin deep in the woods, where the ghost of a murdered prospector was said to roam. His voice was low and dramatic, and we all leaned in, hanging on his every word. And they say, Jordan concluded, his eyes wide with mock fear, that if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can still hear the sound of his pickaxe echoing through the trees. We all laughed, the tension broken, but there was a nervous edge to it. The forest around us seemed darker, the shadows deeper, and the sounds of the night more menacing. All right, enough of that, Emily said, her voice shaky. Let's talk about something else. We agreed, but the mood had shifted. We talked for a while longer, but the laughter was gone, replaced by a sense of unease that none of us could shake. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. We doused the fire, making sure it was completely out, and retreated to our tents. I shared a tent with Alex, and as we crawled into our sleeping bags, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of dread. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful during the day, now felt oppressive, as if it were watching us, waiting for something. You okay? Alex asked, sensing my unease. Yeah, just tired, I lied, trying to brush off the feeling. Me too, Alex said, though his voice was strained. Let's just get some sleep. We'll feel better in the morning. I nodded, closing my eyes and willing myself to relax. But sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside the tent seemed to amplify, echoing in the silence. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't explain. It was probably around midnight when I heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the trees just beyond our campsite. At first I thought it was one of my friends. Maybe someone had gotten up to use the bathroom, but the footsteps didn't match the familiar tread of any of my friends. These were heavier, more deliberate, and they circled the campsite as if someone or something was watching us. I held my breath, straining to hear, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But then I heard a low, guttural growl, followed by a soft, almost human whisper. My blood ran cold. Alex, I whispered, shaking his shoulder. Wake up, he stirred, groggy and confused. What is it? Listen, I said, my voice barely audible. He fell silent, and I knew he heard it too, the footsteps, the growl, the whispering. His eyes widened in the dark, and I saw the fear in them. What the hell is that? He whispered back. I don't know, I replied, my voice trembling. But we need to wake the others. We scrambled out of our sleeping bags, trying to be as quiet as possible. We crept to the other tents, waking Jordan, Emily, and Sarah. They all heard the noises too, and the fear in their eyes mirrored our own. We huddled together, trying to make sense of what we were hearing. The footsteps had stopped, but the growling and whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. What do we do? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. We need to leave, Jordan said, his voice firm. Now we quickly packed up what we could, moving as silently as possible. The growling seemed to follow us, growing more agitated as we moved. The whispering was unintelligible, but it filled me with a deep sense of dread, as if something malevolent was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. We finally made it back to the trailhead where our car was parked. We threw our gear into the trunk and piled into the car, slamming the doors behind us. Jordan fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. but he managed to start the engine. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees. But there was nothing, just darkness and the fading silhouette of the trees. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, back in the safety of the town. We sat in the car for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. None of us spoke, the fear still gripping us tightly. Eventually, Jordan broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," I replied, shaking my head. "But I never want to find out." We all agreed, and that was the last time we ever spoke about that night. We never went back to that forest, never told anyone what we had experienced, but the memories lingered, haunting us in the quiet moments when we were alone. I still think about that night sometimes, wondering what it was that we heard in the forest. Was it an animal, a person, or something else entirely, something that defies explanation? I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that I will never set foot in those woods again, and I will never forget the terror that we felt as we fled from whatever was lurking in the shadows. I'd heard the stories for years, the tales of strange creatures that lurked in the woods near my hometown. They were the kind of stories you'd hear around a campfire, shared between friends as the night grew darker and the shadows stretched longer. Most people laughed them off, dismissing them as nothing more than local folklore, but there were always those who swore the stories were true, who claimed they'd seen something out there in the woods, something that defied explanation. I was never one to believe in such things. I was a man of logic, a firm believer in the tangible and the real. But that all changed one night when I found myself alone in the woods, far from the safety of home, with nothing but the darkness and the trees for company. That it started as a simple camping trip, something I'd done countless times before. I'd always enjoyed the solitude of the woods, the way the world seemed to fall away as soon as you stepped off the beaten path. There was something peaceful about being out there, away from the noise and the chaos of everyday life. It was just me, the trees, and the open sky, but this time was different. From the moment I set up camp, I had the uneasy feeling that I was being watched. It was a subtle thing at first, a prickling at the back of my neck, a sense that there were eyes on me, hidden somewhere in the shadows. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, the unease grew stronger. The woods, usually so full of life, were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects replaced by an oppressive silence. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to focus on setting up my camp, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there just beyond the reach of the firelight. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the darkness, but there was nothing, just the trees, standing silent and still. As night fell, the unease turned to fear. The darkness seemed to press in on me, the shadows growing thicker, more menacing. I could hear the rustle of leaves in the distance, the snap of a twig, the sound of something moving through the underbrush. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a presence, something that shouldn't have been. I sat by the fire, my eyes scanning the darkness, trying to convince myself that it was just a deer or a raccoon, some harmless animal moving through the woods. But deep down, I knew it was something else. The stories I had heard over the years came flooding back to me, tales of a creature that was half man, half beast, something that stalked the woods under the cover of darkness. They called it the dogman, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a wolf, with eyes that glowed in the dark and a howl that could freeze your blood. It was just a story I told myself, just a piece of local folklore meant to scare kids and keep them out of the woods at night. But as the rustling grew louder, closer, I couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to it. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, the beam cutting through the night like a knife. For a moment I saw nothing, just trees and shadows. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was quick, just a flash of movement, but it was enough to send my heart racing. I stood up, my hands shaking as I tried to get a better look. The rustling had stopped, the woods now deathly silent, but I could feel that something was out there, watching me, waiting. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight, but there was nothing, just the trees standing tall and silent. And then I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from somewhere just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a mix of animal and something else, something not quite human. My blood ran cold as the growl grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight beam darting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The growl had stopped, replaced by that oppressive silence, but the fear remained, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. I backed up toward the fire, my eyes scanning the darkness, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows, and then I saw it. At first, it was just a pair of eyes glowing in the dark, staring at me from the edge of the clearing. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew. Then there was something in the way they looked at me, something that sent a shiver down my spine. They were intelligent, calculating, as if whatever was out there was studying me, deciding whether or not to make its move. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared back at those glowing eyes, too terrified to move. And then, slowly, it began to step out of the shadows. The first thing I saw was the shape of its head, canine with pointed ears and a long snout. But as it emerged further into the light, I realized with horror that its body was something else entirely. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, with broad shoulders and long, muscular limbs. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, matted in places as if it had been living in the wild for a long time. But it was the way it moved that terrified me the most. Onto legs, like a man, but with a grace and fluidity that was completely unnatural. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing just outside the reach of the firelight and stared at me, its glowing eyes locked on mine. I could see its breath in the cold night air, each exhale sending a cloud of steam rising into the darkness. It didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me, waiting. I don't know how long we stood like that, me frozen in fear, and the creature staring me down. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes or even seconds. Time seemed to stretch and blur, the world narrowing down to just me and the creature, locked in a silent standoff. And then, without warning, it turned and disappeared back into the woods, its glowing eyes the last thing to vanish into the darkness. The rustling of leaves faded away, and soon there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, too afraid to close my eyes, too terrified of what might be waiting for me in the darkness. As soon as the sun was up, I packed up my things and got out of there as fast as I could. Not daring to look back, I never told anyone about what happened that night. I knew they wouldn't believe me, that they'd laugh it off as just another campfire story, another tall tale to scare the kids. But I knew what I saw, and I knew that whatever it was real. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't plan to. The memories of that night still haunt me. The image of those glowing eyes burned into my mind. I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting for its next encounter, its next victim. And every time I hear a rustle in the trees or a low growl in the night, I can't help but wonder, was it all just a figment of my imagination? Or is there really something out there, something that walks on two legs, with the head of a wolf and the body of a man? I don't know, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, and I'll never go back to those woods, not as long as I live, because some stories, some legends, are best left alone. It was supposed to be just another night shift at St. Mary's Hospital, a small, unassuming building tucked away on the outskirts of town. I had been working there for 3 years, pulling night shifts more often than not. The pay was decent, and I didn't mind the late hours. In fact, I preferred them. The hospital was quieter at night. The hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional beeping of monitors creating a rhythm I had grown accustomed to. The staff on the night shift was a tight-knit group, bound by shared exhaustion, and the odd hours we kept. There was Corinne, the head nurse with a sharp tongue and a heart of gold. Dr. Patel, a kind but overworked physician who always had a cup of coffee in his hand. And Mike, the security guard, who was more interested in his smartphone than in patrolling the halls. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our ways of coping with the long, lonely hours. That night, however, something felt off. The air seemed heavier, the shadows deeper. It was as if the hospital itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to fatigue, that it lingered like a stubborn stain. My shift began as usual with rounds through the dimly lit corridors. Most of the patients were asleep, their faces peaceful in the soft glow of the night lights. I checked their vitals, adjusted their IVs, and made sure everything was in order. It was routine, almost mechanical at this point. But as the hours ticked by, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed it, the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. At first I thought it was one of the other nurses or perhaps Mike making his rounds, but when I looked up, the corridor was empty. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, but no one was there. I shook my head, telling myself I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. But then a shadow moved at the edge of my vision, just beyond the reach of the fluorescent lights. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone, but again the hallway was empty. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. "It's just your imagination," I muttered under my breath. "Get a grip." I returned to my duties, trying to focus on the task at hand, but that sense of dread wouldn't leave me. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and the shadows seemed to stretch and warp, as if something was moving through them, unseen. I was about to head to the nurse's station when I heard a soft, almost inaudible whisper. It was coming from one of the rooms, room 304, which had been empty for weeks. The room was scheduled for renovation, the bed stripped, and the equipment covered in dust sheets. No one had any reason to be in there. My heart raced as I approached the door, the whispering growing louder, more distinct. It wasn't any language I recognized. It was guttural, almost like a chant. I hesitated at the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. For a moment I considered turning back, pretending I hadn't heard anything, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking in the silence. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small window near the ceiling. I stepped inside, my breath hitching as I scanned the room. It was empty, just as it should have been. but the air was thick with a sense of unease, as if something had been there only moments before. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse, and for a brief second I thought I saw something move beneath the dust sheets. I blinked, and whatever it was gone. I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I hurried back to the nurse's station, trying to shake off the fear that clung to me. Karen was there, her eyes fixed on the monitor in front of her, but she looked up when she saw me. "You okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "Yeah, just a bit jumpy tonight," I replied, forcing a smile. "Too much coffee, I guess." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. We settled into a comfortable silence, the sound of the monitors and the occasional distant noise from the patients' rooms filling the void. But I couldn't stop thinking about room 304, about the footsteps and the whispering. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but that sense of dread never left me. When my shift finally ended, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I drove home, with the radio turned up loud, trying to drown out the memories of the night. But sleep was elusive, my mind replaying the events over and over. I told myself I was being silly, that it was just my imagination running wild in the middle of the night. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next night, I was back at the hospital, the same sense of unease gnawing at me as I walked through the doors. I tried to push it aside, focusing on my work, but it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. It was around the same time, 2 a.m., when I heard the footsteps again. This time they were louder, more insistent, and they seemed to be coming from all around me. I froze, my heart racing as I looked around, but again there was no one there. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, and I felt a cold breeze brush past me, even though there were no windows open. Then I heard it, the whispering. It was louder this time, clearer, and it was coming from all directions. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I wasn't alone. Something was there, something I couldn't see, but I could feel its presence, oppressive and malevolent. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the empty hallway. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost deafening. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The words, if they were words, were inside my head, echoing and reverberating until I thought I would go mad. Just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. I stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I wanted to run, to get out of that hospital and never look back, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Finally, I forced myself to move, to walk back to the nurse's station. Karen was there, her face pale and drawn. She looked at me with wide eyes, and I knew she had heard it, too. "What the hell is going on?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, "but I think this place is haunted. We didn't talk about it again, not that night or any other. But the fear never left us, a constant companion during those long, lonely shifts. The hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was a place of shadows and whispers, of things unseen and unknown. I eventually left St. Mary's, unable to handle the growing fear that consumed me with each passing night. I moved to another town, took a job at a different hospital, but the memories of those nights stayed with me. I still hear the whispers sometimes in the dead of night when I'm all alone. I tell myself it's just my imagination, that there's nothing to fear. But deep down, I know the truth. Some places are haunted, not just by the dead, but by the darkness that lies within them, waiting to consume anyone who dares to step inside. I've always loved the woods. There's something about being surrounded by nature, the scent of pine in the air, the rustling of leaves underfoot, that makes me feel alive. I used to go camping almost every weekend, just me and the wilderness, away from the noise and stress of everyday life. It was my escape, my sanctuary. But now I can't even look at a forest without feeling a deep, bone-chilling fear. It all started one summer, during what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend camping trip. I'd found a spot deep in the forest, far from any trails or roads, the kind of place where you could truly be alone. I set up my tent, built a fire, and spent the day exploring the surrounding woods. It was peaceful, just me and the trees, the birds singing overhead, the occasional rustle of a squirrel or a deer in the underbrush. As the sun began to set, I returned to my camp, tired but content. I made dinner, sat by the fire, and watched the stars come out one by one. The night was calm, the air cool and crisp, the perfect night for camping. But as I sat there staring into the flames, I started to get the feeling that something was off. The woods, usually so full of life, were eerily quiet. There were no crickets, no owls, just silence, heavy and oppressive. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the darkness, but there was nothing, just the trees, standing silent and still. I decided to call it a night, hoping that sleep would put my mind at ease. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the door, and lay down, trying to let the sound of the fire crackling outside lull me to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I lay there in the dark, my eyes wide open, staring at the roof of the tent, listening. And then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like someone or something moving through the trees. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of the fire, but it was there, growing closer. My heart started to race as I listened, trying to figure out what it was. It didn't sound like any animal I knew, more like something bigger. The sound stopped just outside my tent, and I held my breath, straining to hear. There was a long moment of silence, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then, slowly, the sound started again, circling my camp, moving just outside the ring of firelight. It was deliberate, almost methodical, like something was testing the boundaries, waiting for the right moment to strike. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that the darkness and the isolation were playing tricks on my mind, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. There was something out there, something that shouldn't have been. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the night. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I shone the flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing, just the trees, standing tall and silent. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the woods, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. And then, just as I was about to turn back to the tent, I caught a glimpse of something movement, just at the edge of the light. I whipped the flashlight around, trying to get a better look, but whatever it was had already disappeared back into the shadows. My heart was pounding in my chest as I scanned the trees, but there was nothing, just darkness, thick and impenetrable. I stood there, frozen, listening to the silence, waiting for something to happen. But the only sound was the crackling of the fires slowly dying out. I tried to convince myself that it was just a deer or a raccoon, some harmless animal moving through the woods. But I knew deep down that it was something else, something that was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the fire, adding wood whenever it started to burn low, trying to keep the darkness at bay. I kept my flashlight in hand, the beam pointed toward the trees, ready to shine it at the first sign of movement. But nothing came. The night passed in silence, the only sound my own ragged breathing and the occasional crackle of the fire. As soon as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I packed up my things and got out of there as fast as I could. Not daring to look back, I told myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. But the feeling of unease stayed with me long after I left the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out, that whatever had been watching me that night was still out there, waiting. I stopped going camping after that. The woods, once my sanctuary, had become a place of fear, a place I couldn't bring myself to return to. But it wasn't until years later that I found out I wasn't alone. I was talking to a friend of mine, someone who knew the woods around our town as well as I did, and he told me a story that made my blood run cold. He'd been camping in the same area where I had my encounter, and he'd heard the same sounds, felt the same presence. He described it in chilling detail, the feeling of being watched, the sound of something moving through the trees, the oppressive silence that filled the woods. And then he told me something that sent a shiver down my spine. He'd seen it. Whatever it was, he'd caught a glimpse of it, just at the edge of the firelight. He described it as a tall, shadowy figure, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. He said it moved with an unnatural grace, almost like it was gliding through the trees. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, disappearing back into the shadows. He said he'd never gone back to those woods, and after hearing his story, I knew I never would either. There's something out there, something that defies explanation, something that stalks the woods under the cover of darkness. I don't know what it is, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that it's real, and it's out there, waiting. So if you ever find yourself alone in the woods, far from the safety of home, and you start to feel like you're being watched, like something is moving through the trees just out of sight, trust your instincts. Get out of there and don't look back, because some stories, some legends, are more than just tales told around a campfire. Some of them are real, and they're best left alone. The old lighthouse stood at the edge of the cliffs, overlooking the turbulent waters of the North Atlantic. For over a century, it had guided ships safely through the treacherous rocks below, its beam cutting through the thick fog that often rolled in from the sea. It was a lonely post, isolated from the nearest town by miles of rugged coastline, but I had always been drawn to the solitude. As the lighthouse keeper, I found comfort in the routine, in the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs, and the constant hum of the wind. My name is Walter Hargrove, and I had been the keeper of the Beacon Point Lighthouse for nearly 20 years. It was a job passed down through my family, from my grandfather to my father, and finally to me. My father had always said the sea was in our blood, that we were destined to keep the light burning, to protect those who ventured into the dark, unforgiving waters. I had taken pride in my work, in the knowledge that I was part of something greater than myself. The lighthouse was more than just a job. It was my life, my purpose. But over the years, the isolation had begun to weigh on me. The days were long, the nights even longer, and the loneliness had become a constant companion. The nearest town, Harpswell, was a small fishing village, and I only went there once a month to pick up supplies and send letters. The villagers were friendly enough, but they kept their distance, as if the lighthouse and those who tended it were somehow cursed. They spoke in hushed tones about the watchers, spirits of the lost souls who had perished in shipwrecks, said to haunt the lighthouse and the surrounding cliffs. I had always dismissed their stories as nothing more than superstition, the product of too many nights spent listening to the howling wind and the crashing waves. But as the years passed, I began to wonder if there was some truth to their tales. It was a particularly stormy night in early November when things began to change. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and doors of the lighthouse, and the waves pounded against the cliffs with a fury I hadn't seen in years. I was sitting in the keeper's quarters, a small, cramped room at the base of the lighthouse, reading an old, tattered book by the light of a kerosene lamp. The storm had knocked out the electricity, and the only source of light was the lamp and the beam from the lighthouse above. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the walls. As I sat there, trying to lose myself in the book, I heard a noise that made me freeze. It was a faint tapping sound coming from the door to the lighthouse tower. I set the book down, my heart racing as I listened intently. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, as if someone or something was knocking on the door. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. The door to the tower was always locked from the inside, and the only key was in my pocket. No one could have gotten in without my knowing. I grabbed the oil lamp and cautiously approached the door. The tapping grew louder as I got closer, more insistent. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, hesitating for just a moment before turning it and pulling the door open. The tower was empty, the spiral staircase winding up into the darkness above. The tapping stopped as soon as I opened the door, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, before stepping inside and closing the door behind me. The sound of the wind and rain outside was muffled by the thick stone walls, and the only sound was the soft creaking of the stairs as I began to climb. As I ascended the stairs, the temperature dropped, the air growing colder with each step. I could see my breath in the dim light of the lamp, and a chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. I had to know what was happening, what had caused the tapping on the door. When I reached the top of the stairs, I found myself in the lantern room, the glass walls offering a view of the raging storm outside. The light from the beacon was steady, casting long shadows across the room. But there was something else there, something that shouldn't have been there. Standing in the center of the room was a figure, tall and gaunt, dressed in a tattered old coat that looked like it had been pulled from the depths of the sea. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were dark and hollow. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the lamp, as the figure turned to face me. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer, didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes. I could feel the cold radiating from him, that deep, bone-chilling cold that seeped into my very soul. I wanted to run, to flee from that room, and never look back, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The figure took a step towards me, and I could see the water dripping from his coat, pooling on the floor beneath him. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a deep, suffocating silence. "Leave this place," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. "You're not welcome here." The figure paused, his hollow eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something, pain, fear, regret, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Then, without a word, he turned and walked towards the window, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity before finally forcing myself to move. I rushed down the stairs, not caring if I tripped or fell, desperate to get away from that room, from whatever that thing was. When I reached the keeper's quarters, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the fire, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to even close my eyes. The storm raged on outside, but the tapping never returned, and the figure never reappeared. The next morning, when the storm had finally passed, I ventured back up to the lantern room. The air was still cold, and the room felt heavy with an unseen presence, but the figure was gone. The only evidence that he had been there at all was a small puddle of water in the center of the room, slowly evaporating in the morning light. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a dream, a figment of my imagination brought on by the isolation and the storm. But deep down I knew better. The figure I had seen was real, and he was a reminder of the darkness that lurked in the depths of the sea, of the souls lost to the unforgiving waters. I never spoke of that night to anyone, not even to the man who came to relieve me when my time at the lighthouse was over. I left Beacon Point with a heavy heart, knowing that I had been a witness to something beyond my understanding, something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Now, years later, I still think about that night, about the figure in the lantern room and the cold that had seeped into my bones. I wonder if he is still there, watching over the lighthouse, waiting for the next keeper to take up the mantle. I wonder if he is waiting for someone to help him find peace, or if he is doomed to wander the cliffs and the lighthouse for eternity, a lost soul trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead. All I know is that I will never forget the night I spent in the Beacon Point lighthouse, and I will never be able to shake the feeling that some things are better left unseen, that some stories are better left untold. The day had been sweltering, the kind of heat that clung to your skin like a wet blanket, making every breath feel like a chore. So when night finally fell, I welcomed the cool breeze that swept through the forest. My friend Jeremy and I had planned this camping trip for months, a chance to get away from the grind of city life and reconnect with nature. We'd chosen a spot deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, the perfect place to escape from everything. Or so we thought. The fire crackled softly as we sat around it, the flames casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. We'd been talking and laughing, the worries of the world melting away as the night wore on. The stars above us were brilliant, so clear and bright without the interference of city lights. It felt like we were the only two people in the world, alone in a vast wilderness. It was late, well past midnight, when I first noticed the silence. Jeremy had just finished telling a story, some old ghost tale he'd heard as a kid, and we both fell quiet, letting the night settle around us. But instead of the usual sounds of the forest crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, there was nothing. Just an eerie, unnatural stillness. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jeremy frowned, listening for a moment before shaking his head. "I don't hear anything," he replied. And that's when it hit me the problem wasn't what we could hear, but what we couldn't. The forest, usually so full of life, had gone completely silent. A shiver ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I stood up, glancing around the campsite, trying to peer into the darkness beyond the firelight. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches twisting and curling like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab us. Jeremy must have noticed the change in my demeanor, because he stood up too, his expression growing serious. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," I replied, my eyes scanning the darkened woods, "but something doesn't feel right. We should probably pack up and head back to the car." Jeremy hesitated, clearly not wanting to cut the trip short. but something in my tone must have convinced him. We started to gather our things, quickly and quietly, the uneasy silence pressing down on us like a weight. That's when we heard a soft rustling sound coming from the trees just beyond the campsite. It was faint, barely noticeable, but in the dead stillness of the night, it might as well have been a gunshot. We both froze, listening intently. The rustling grew louder, closer, as if something or someone was moving through the underbrush. My heart was pounding in my chest as I strained to see what was out there, but the darkness was thick, impenetrable. "Do you see anything?" Jeremy whispered, his voice tight with fear. I shook my head, my eyes wide as I scanned the tree line. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it movement just at the edge of the firelight. It was quick, almost too fast to catch, but there was no mistaking it. Something was out there. "We need to go now," I said, my voice trembling. Jeremy didn't argue. We grabbed our bags and put out the fire, the darkness closing in around us like a living thing. The rustling sound grew louder, more insistent, as we hurried to gather our things. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. We had just started down the trail, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, when we heard it again, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from somewhere behind us. We both turned, shining our lights into the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows and the faint outline of the trees swaying in the breeze. "Did you hear that?" Jeremy asked, his voice shaking. I nodded, too afraid to speak. We started walking faster, our footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness of the night. But the growling didn't stop. It seemed to follow us, growing louder and more menacing with each step. Panic set in, and we broke into a run, the trail twisting and turning through the trees. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no logic to it, no explanation that made sense. All I knew was that we needed to get out of there. Fast, the growling grew louder, closer, as if whatever was following us was right on our heels. I could feel it, the presence of something dark and malevolent, something that didn't belong in this world. The trees seemed to close in around us, the branches reaching out like claws, trying to pull us back into the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the growling stopped. The silence was deafening, the only sound our ragged breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. We slowed to a stop, looking around, our flashlights sweeping the trees. There was nothing there, no sign of whatever had been chasing us, no indication that we weren't alone in those woods. "Do you think it's gone?" Jeremy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to believe that we were safe, that whatever had been following us had given up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. We stood there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. And then, just as we were about to start walking again, I heard a soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was coming from the trees just ahead of us, and it was saying my name, David. The voice was faint, almost like a breath of wind, but it sent a chill down my spine. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was nothing there, just the trees, silent and unmoving. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Jeremy nodded, his face pale in the dim light. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice tight with fear. I couldn't have agreed more. We started running again, the fear driving us forward, the trees whipping past us as we sprinted down the trail. We didn't stop until we reached the car, breathless and terrified, the night still and silent around us. We jumped in, locking the doors behind us, and sped away, not daring to look back. It wasn't until we were miles away, the lights of the town in the distance, that we finally started to relax. But the fear didn't go away. It clung to us, a dark cloud that followed us even in the safety of our homes. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, replaying the events of that night over and over in my mind. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something had followed us out of those woods. Something that wasn't done with us yet. It's been years since that night, but I still can't shake the feeling that I am being watched, that something is out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. I don't go camping anymore. I can't bring myself to set foot in the woods, not after what happened. I don't know what we encountered that night, and I don't want to know. All I know is that some places are best left alone, and some things should never be disturbed. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, far from civilization, and you start to feel like something is watching you, like the very forest itself is alive, listen to your instincts. Get out of there and don't look back, because some things are better left in the dark, where they belong. It started with the animals. At first, it was just a few missing chickens. Then a goat vanished without a trace. Old man Miller swore it was wolves, or maybe coyotes, though none had been seen in the area for years. His farm was tucked away in a remote corner of the county, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to stretch on forever. Folks around town had always avoided those woods, claiming they were haunted or cursed. It was just old folklore, the kind of tales passed down to keep kids from wandering too far. But after what I saw, I know better. My name is Aaron Davies, and I'd lived in the same small town all my life. Miller's farm was just a few miles down the road from where I grew up, and I knew the place well. I'd worked there every summer since I was 13, helping with the harvest, fixing fences, and doing odd jobs. Miller was a tough old man, gruff but fair, and he paid well enough that I never complained about the long hours. That summer, I was 17 and eager to make some extra cash before heading off to college in the fall. It was mid-July when things took a turn for the worse. The disappearances had been happening for weeks, but nobody paid much attention until one of Miller's dogs went missing. Rex was an old shepherd, mean as a snake but loyal to Miller, and he never strayed far from the house. When he didn't show up for breakfast one morning, Miller knew something was wrong. He called me up, asking if I'd help him search the property. I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else. I figured Rex had wandered off into the woods and gotten lost, maybe chasing after whatever had taken the chickens and the goat. We spent the better part of the day combing the farm, calling for Rex, but there was no sign of him. By late afternoon, we were both exhausted and ready to call it quits. As we headed back to the house, something caught my eye. Just beyond the tree line, there was a small clearing that I'd never noticed before. It was strange because I'd been all over that property, and I knew it like the back of my hand. But this clearing, it was new, or at least it seemed that way. "Hey, Mr. Miller," I called out, pointing toward the trees. "Have you ever seen that clearing before?" Miller squinted in the direction I was pointing, his weathered face creasing in a frown. "Can't say I have," he muttered, more to himself than to me. Without another word, he started walking toward the clearing, and I followed close behind. The trees in that part of the woods were tall and ancient, their gnarled branches twisting overhead like a canopy. As we entered the clearing, I felt a sudden chill, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something I couldn't quite place. It was a sickly sweet smell, like rotting fruit, and it made my stomach turn. In the center of the clearing was a large, flat stone, partially covered in moss and lichen. It looked like it had been there for centuries, forgotten and overgrown. But there was something strange about it. The moss had been disturbed, scraped away in places to reveal strange markings carved into the stone. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen before, not letters or symbols, but more like deep grooves cut into the rock in random patterns. Miller knelt down beside the stone, brushing away more of the moss with his hand. "What do you make of this?" he asked, his voice low and uncertain. I shook my head. "I don't know. Could be some kind of old marker, maybe something left behind by the folks who lived here before." Miller didn't respond. He just stared at the stone, his brow furrowed in thought. After a few moments, he stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. "We should head back," he said, his voice firm. "It's getting late." There was something in his tone that unsettled me, a sense of urgency that I hadn't heard before. I nodded and followed him back through the trees, glancing over my shoulder at the clearing as we left. The stone seemed to glisten in the fading light, the grooves catching the last rays of the sun before they disappeared into the shadows. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day in my mind. The stone, the markings, the clearing, it all felt off, like we'd stumbled onto something that wasn't meant to be found. I finally drifted off to sleep, but my dreams were filled with images of the stone and the dark woods surrounding it. The next morning, I went back to the farm, hoping to put the whole thing behind me, but when I arrived, I knew something was terribly wrong. The front door of the farmhouse was wide open, hanging crooked on its hinges, and the windows were shattered. I rushed inside, calling out for Miller, but there was no answer. The house was a mess, furniture overturned, dishes smashed on the floor, and strange, muddy footprints leading from room to room. I followed the footprints upstairs, my heart racing. They led to Miller's bedroom, where the door was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, dread creeping up my spine. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, but I could make out the shape of Miller lying on the bed. At first I thought he was asleep, but as I stepped closer, I realized the truth. Miller was dead, his body twisted and contorted in a way that didn't seem possible. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. But what terrified me the most were the deep, bloody grooves carved into his chest, the same patterns he had seen on the stone and the clearing. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I bolted out of the house. I didn't stop running until I was halfway home, my mind racing with questions. What had happened to Miller? What had we uncovered in those woods? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back to that farm, not for any amount of money. In the days that followed, I kept to myself, too afraid to tell anyone what I'd seen. The sheriff came by to ask questions, but I lied, telling him I hadn't been to the farm that day. I couldn't bring myself to speak the truth, not when I still didn't understand what had happened. But the nightmares continued, relentless and vivid. I dreamed of the stone, of the markings, of the dark figure that hovered at the edge of the clearing, watching me with cold, empty eyes. I knew it was only a matter of time before whatever had taken Miller came for me. 2 weeks later, the nightmares stopped. I woke up one morning, drenched in sweat, with a sense of finality. I knew what I had to do. I packed a bag and left town that same day, never looking back. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my family. I just drove, putting as much distance between myself and those woods as I could. It's been 20 years since I left, and I've never returned. I've tried to move on, to build a new life, but the memories still haunt me. I see the stone in my dreams, the markings, the clearing, and I hear Miller's voice calling out to me from the shadows. I've spent years researching, trying to find answers, but there's nothing. No records, no history, nothing that explains what we found in those woods. And that's what terrifies me the most, whatever it was. It's still out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next unlucky soul to stumble upon it. So if you ever find yourself near Miller's farm, do yourself a favor and stay away from the woods. Don't go looking for the clearing, and whatever you do, don't touch the stone. Some things are better left buried, forgotten, and lost to time. Because once you've seen what I've seen, there's no going back. There's no escape from the darkness that lingers in those woods, and no way to outrun the terror that follows you home. It was supposed to be a routine night, nothing more than a peaceful patrol through the quiet woods of Maple Creek. I'd been a night security guard at the Maple Creek Wildlife Reserve for over 3 years, and in all that time, I'd never encountered anything more dangerous than a lost camper or the occasional curious bear. The reserve was known for its serenity, a haven for wildlife, and those who sought to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. But that night the peace was shattered in a way that I'll never forget. The night started like any other. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the woods were coming alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures stirring from their slumber. I climbed into my patrol vehicle, a sturdy old Jeep that had seen better days, and set off on my usual route. The radio crackled with the familiar static, a comforting background noise as I drove along the narrow dirt roads that crisscrossed the reserve. The first couple of hours passed without incident. I made my rounds, checking the various campsites and trailheads, making sure everything was in order. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. It was the kind of peacefulness that made the job easy, lulling you into a sense of security. But as the night wore on, something began to change. It was subtle at first, just a feeling of unease that crept over me like a cold fog. The usual sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. I was just about to head back to the main gate when I saw it. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees as my headlights cut through the darkness. But as I drew closer, I realized that it was no shadow. Standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the twin beams of my headlights, was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a thick, muscular build. Its fur was dark and matted, covering its body in a tangled mess that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. But it was the face that struck me the most. It was the face of a dog, but twisted, distorted, with sharp, elongated features that gave it an almost human-like appearance. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural yellow light, and its lips were curled back in a snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest as I stared at the creature, unable to move or even think. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, locked in a silent standoff. And then, without warning, it let out a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down my spine. The sound was deep, primal, and it seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. The creature took a step forward, and that's when the spell broke. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, the tires screeching as the Jeep lurched forward. The creature moved with lightning speed, darting off the road and disappearing into the trees before I could even register what had happened. I didn't stop to see where it went. I just kept driving, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel as I sped back to the main gate. When I finally reached the safety of the gatehouse, I was shaking so badly that I could barely get the key into the lock. I stumbled inside, locking the door behind me and collapsing into the nearest chair, my mind racing with what I'd just seen. I grabbed the radio, my hands trembling as I tried to call for backup, but all I got was static. The realization that I was completely alone hit me like a ton of bricks. I spent the rest of the night holed up in that gatehouse, my eyes glued to the windows, watching for any sign of the creature. But it never came. The woods remained silent, as if the very forest itself was holding its breath. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief so intense that I almost cried. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next morning, but he just laughed it off, dismissing it as nothing more than a bear or a large wolf. But I knew what I'd seen, and it was no ordinary animal. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream, that my mind had been playing tricks on me in the dark, but the memory of those glowing yellow eyes and the sound of that growl haunted me long after the sun had risen. I continued to work at the reserve, but I never went on night patrols again. I couldn't bring myself to go back out there in the dark, not after what I'd seen. I'd hear stories from other guards, whispers of strange sightings and unexplained noises, but none of them seemed to take it seriously. They didn't understand. They hadn't seen what I'd seen. It's been years since that night, that the memory is still as vivid as ever. I've never told anyone else about it. Not really. People don't believe in things like that, not unless they see it for themselves. But I know what's out there, lurking in the shadows of the Maple Creek woods. It's real, and it's watching, waiting for the next unlucky soul to cross its path. Driving through the back roads of rural Idaho at night was something I had always enjoyed. The peace and quiet, the endless stretch of dark road ahead, the occasional twinkling of stars through the canopy of trees. It was my own kind of meditation. My job as a delivery driver often took me through these isolated routes, and over the years, I'd grown accustomed to the solitude. But that night, something felt off. The usual comfort I found in the silence was replaced by an annoying sense of unease. I brushed it off as exhaustion. It had been a long day. After all, the clock on the dashboard read 1:47 a.m. I was on the last leg of my journey, just a couple more hours until I could unload my cargo and head home. The road was empty, not a car or a soul in sight, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow, winding road ahead. I was about to turn up the radio to break the silence, and I saw something up ahead, a figure standing by the side of the road. It was unusual, to say the least. I rarely saw anyone out here, especially at this hour. As I got closer, I could make out more details. It was a woman, wearing a long, dark coat, her hair hanging down over her face. She stood perfectly still, her head slightly bowed, as if she was waiting for something or someone. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. My first instinct was to keep driving, to pretend I hadn't seen her, but something made me stop. Maybe it was the way she was standing there, so still, so alone, or maybe it was the faint glimmer of hope that she was just someone in need of help. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Are you all right?" I called out. She didn't respond at first, just stood there, staring at the ground. I was about to repeat myself when she finally looked up, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes, there was something wrong with her eyes. They were empty, hollow, like she was looking right through me. She took a step closer to the truck, and I instinctively reached for the door handle, ready to drive off if things got weird. But she stopped just a few feet away from the window and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Can you give me a ride?" There was something about her voice, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was soft, almost too soft, like it was coming from far away. But I pushed the unease aside and nodded. "Sure. Where are you headed?" She didn't answer right away, just looked at me with those empty eyes, and then she whispered, "Home." I unlocked the door, and she climbed into the passenger seat without a word. The truck felt colder with her inside, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. I tried to make small talk as I started driving again, asking her where she lived, but she didn't respond. She just stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap, her body unnaturally still. I glanced at her from time to time, but she never looked back, never said a word. The silence was suffocating, the only sound the low rumble of the engine and the tires on the asphalt. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a small town up ahead, the first signs of civilization in miles. I was about to ask if this was where she wanted to be dropped off when she finally spoke. "Turn left," she said, her voice barely audible over the engine. I did as she asked, turning onto a narrow, unpaved road that led away from the town. The further we went, the more isolated it became, the trees closing in on either side, the darkness swallowing us whole. I started to feel uneasy again, that same knowing feeling I had had earlier, only now it was stronger, more insistent. Something wasn't right. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know this road, and she still hadn't told me where she lived. "Are we getting close?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer, just kept staring straight ahead, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I was about to ask again when she suddenly said, "Stop." I hit the brakes, bringing the truck to a stop in the middle of the road. There was nothing around us, just trees and darkness. I looked at her, waiting for some explanation, but she didn't move, didn't speak. She just sat there, staring out into the night. "This isn't your home," I said, my voice trembling slightly. She slowly turned her head to look at me, and for the first time I saw something in her eyes, fear. "I'm not safe here," she whispered. "You need to go." Before I could respond, she reached for the door handle and got out of the truck, disappearing into the trees without another word. I sat there for a moment, stunned, not sure what to do. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of there as fast as I could, but something held me back. I got out of the truck, calling after her, "Wait, where are you going?" There was no answer, just the rustle of leaves in the wind. I took a few steps into the trees, trying to see where she'd gone, but there was nothing, no sign of her, no footprints, nothing. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. A deep sense of dread settled over me, and I knew I had to leave. I hurried back to the truck, my heart pounding in my chest, and peeled out of there, not daring to look back. As I drove back to the main road, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was she? Where had she gone? But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When I finally made it to the town, I pulled into the first gas station I saw, my hands still shaking as I filled up the tank. The clerk inside gave me a strange look when I went to pay, probably because I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't mention the woman, didn't tell anyone what had happened. I just wanted to get back home, put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. But as I drove, the image of her pale face, and empty eyes kept replaying in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that she was still out there, somewhere, following me. It wasn't until I got home, locked the door behind me, and collapsed into bed that I finally allowed myself to relax. I told myself it was just a strange encounter, nothing more. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. The next morning I woke up to a knock on the door. I opened it to find a police officer standing on my doorstep, his expression grave. "Are you Jack Mason?" he asked. I nodded, my heart sinking. "Yes, that's me. Is something wrong?" He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "We found your truck abandoned on the side of the road last night. The driver's seat was empty, but the passenger's seat was covered in blood." I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. Blood? But that's impossible. I drove home. I parked it in my driveway. The officer shook his head. "The truck was found miles from here, near a place called Willow Creek. Do you know it?" I nodded slowly, the name sending a shiver down my spine. Willow Creek was where I'd dropped off the hitchhiker. But I hadn't abandoned my truck. I'd driven it home. "That's not possible," I whispered, more to myself than to him. The officer's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Mason, have you been feeling all right lately? Maybe you should come down to the station with me, just to answer a few questions." I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain what had happened. I followed him to the station, my mind in a fog. I answered their questions as best I could, but nothing made sense. They said there were no signs of the woman I'd picked up, no indication that she'd ever been in the truck. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. In the days that followed, I tried to go back to my normal routine, tried to forget about that night, but it was impossible. The image of the hitchhiker haunted me, her hollow eyes staring at me from every shadow, every dark corner. And then the calls started. It was always late at night, the phone ringing just as I was drifting off to sleep. I'd pick it up, and there'd be nothing but silence on the other end. At first, I thought it was just a prank, maybe even the police trying to mess with me. But then I started to hear it, a faint whisper, a voice I couldn't quite make out. I started to dread the nights, the moment when the phone would ring, that voice on the other end reminding me of the woman I'd picked up. One night I couldn't take it anymore. When the phone rang, I answered it, and instead of hanging up, I spoke. "What do you want? Who are you?" There was a long pause, and then the voice spoke, clearer this time. "You shouldn't have stopped." My blood ran cold. It was her. I knew it was her. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking, and unplugged it from the wall. But it didn't stop. The calls kept coming, the same time every night, the same voice whispering those same words. "You shouldn't have stopped. I don't know how much more of this I can take. I've stopped driving at night, stopped taking those back roads, but it doesn't matter. She's found me, and I don't think she's ever going to let me go. I don't know what she wants, don't know what I did to deserve this, but I can't escape it. I can't escape her. So if you're ever driving down a lonely road in the middle of the night, and you see someone standing by the side of the road, do yourself a favor, don't stop. No matter how much they need help, no matter how much you want to be a good person, just keep driving. Because once you've let them in, once you've opened that door, there's no going back. They'll find you, they'll follow you, and they'll never, ever let you go." It was the kind of night that made you question why you ever took the job in the first place. The old mill was supposed to be my last stop before I headed home. Just a quick check to make sure everything was locked up tight and that the night was going smoothly. But from the moment I pulled up to the crumbling brick building, I had the distinct feeling that something was wrong. The mill had been abandoned for years, a relic of a bygone era, when it was the lifeblood of our small town. Now it stood as a ghostly reminder of what once was, its towering smokestack reaching up to the sky like a skeletal finger. The place had always given me the creeps, but I never had any real reason to be afraid until that night I killed the engine and stepped out of my car, the gravel crunching under my boots as I approached the entrance. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the only sound was the distant hum of the highway, far removed from the desolation that surrounded me. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness as I made my way toward the heavy wooden doors. I had only just reached for the handle when I heard a faint, almost imperceptible creak coming from somewhere inside the building. I froze, my hand hovering in midair as I strained to listen. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing, heavy and labored in the stillness of the night. And then it came again, louder this time, like the groan of old floorboards under the weight of something or someone. I swallowed hard, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn around and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't just leave. It was my job to make sure the place was secure, and the thought of something or someone breaking in on my watch was enough to override my fear. I pushed the door open with a loud creak, the sound echoing through the cavernous interior of the mill. The beam of my flashlight swept across the dusty floor, illuminating old machinery that had long since fallen into disrepair. The place was a maze of rusted gears and rotting wood, the perfect setting for a horror movie. But this wasn't a movie, and I was very much alone. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty space as I made my way deeper into the building. The air was thick with dust, and every step sent up little clouds of it that danced in the light of my flashlight. The sound had come from the upper level, where the old offices were located. So that's where I headed. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed, each step seeming to take an eternity as I slowly made my way up. When I finally reached the top, I paused, listening for any sign of movement. The silence was deafening, and I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing when I heard it again, a low, almost inaudible shuffle, like the sound of someone dragging something across the floor. My heart was pounding in my chest as I moved toward the sound, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. I rounded a corner and found myself standing in front of the door to one of the old offices. The door was slightly ajar, and from the small gap I could see that the room beyond was pitch black. I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the doorframe, and then, with a deep breath, I pushed the door open. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was empty, save for an old wooden desk and a chair that had been pushed up against the far wall. But it wasn't the emptiness that terrified me, it was the fact that the chair was slowly rocking back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting in it. I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing, and then, without warning, the chair stopped moving. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I took a cautious step into the room, my flashlight sweeping across the walls in search of anything out of place. But there was nothing, just the chair, now still and silent, and the sense that I was being watched. I backed out of the room, my pulse racing as I hurried down the stairs. I didn't care about securing the building anymore. All I wanted was to get out of there and put as much distance between myself and the mill as possible. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the darkness. I whipped my flashlight around, and that's when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway I had just come through. The figure was tall and gaunt, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to long for its body. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and bolted for the exit, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted across the dusty floor. The door seemed to be a mile away, but I kept running, driven by pure, unadulterated fear. I could hear something behind me, the sound of footsteps gaining on me with every second, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the door and slammed into it, fumbling with the handle as I struggled to get it open. The footsteps were right behind me now, so close I could feel the presence at my back. And then, just as I wrenched the door open and stumbled outside, the footsteps stopped. I didn't turn around, didn't even pause to catch my breath. I just ran to my car, threw open the door, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, the lights of the mill fading in the rearview mirror. It wasn't until I was safe inside my own home, the door locked and bolted behind me, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. I never went back to the mill after that night. I quit my job the next day and moved away from that town, leaving behind everything I had ever known. But the memory of that night has stayed with me, haunting my dreams and turning every shadow into a potential threat. I'll never forget the way that figure looked at me, the way it seemed to know exactly what I was thinking, what I was feeling. It wasn't human of that much, I'm certain, and whatever it was, it's still out there, lurking in the shadows of the old mill, waiting for its next victim. The woods had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could escape from the noise and chaos of everyday life. Cedar Hollow was the kind of place that people avoided, remote, thick with trees, and said to be haunted by all manner of things that went up in the night. But I never believed in any of that. To me, it was just a peaceful stretch of forest where I could hike for miles without seeing another soul. That was until the night I saw it. I decided to go for a late evening hike. It wasn't something I usually did, but the day had been unusually warm for the time of year, and I wanted to make the most of it. I grabbed my backpack, slipped a flashlight into my pocket, and set off just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The trail through Cedar Hollow was one I knew like the back of my hand, winding through the dense undergrowth and ancient trees that seemed to whisper secrets as the wind passed through them. As the light faded, the woods around me took on an eerie quality, the shadows growing longer and deeper until it felt like I was walking through a tunnel of darkness. But I wasn't afraid. I'd been in those woods more times than I could count, and I knew there was nothing out there that could hurt me, or so I thought. I'd been walking for about an hour when I first noticed something was off. The usual sounds of the forest chirping, crickets, rustling leaves had all but disappeared, leaving an unnatural silence in their wake. It was as if the entire woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear anything that might explain the sudden stillness, but there was nothing, just silence. And then I heard a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere up ahead. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd expect to hear in the woods. It wasn't a bear or a wolf or anything else that belonged in those trees. It was something else, something that sent a shiver down my spine and made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around and head back the way I had come, but another part, the part that had always been curious about the unknown, urged me to keep going. So, against my better judgment, I pressed on, my steps slow and cautious, as I followed the trail deeper into the woods. The growling grew louder as I walked, a menacing sound that seemed to reverberate through the trees. It was close to close, and I could feel my hands start to shake as I realized just how vulnerable I was out there, alone in the dark, with nothing but a flashlight and a small pocket knife for protection. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees that had taken on an oddly humanoid shape. But as I moved closer, I realized it was no shadow. It was something much more terrifying. It stood on two legs, hunched over slightly as if it was too tall to stand upright under the canopy of trees. Its body was covered in coarse, dark fur that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight, and its eyes, those horrible, glowing eyes, stared at me with an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. I froze. Every muscle in my body tensed as I locked eyes with the creature. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with arms that hung down past its knees and hands tipped with claws that looked like they could tear through flesh with ease. Its face was the stuff of nightmares, elongated, almost wolf-like, with a snout full of sharp, yellowing teeth that were bared in a snarl. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was as if time had stopped, the only sound the pounding of my heart in my ears. And then, without warning, the creature took a step toward me, its movements fluid and unnervingly graceful for something so large. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the spot as the creature advanced. It stopped just a few feet away from me, close enough that I could smell its foul breath and see the glistening saliva dripping from its fangs. It growled again, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct I had was telling me to run, but I knew that if I did, I wouldn't make it far. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and vanished into the trees, its massive form disappearing into the shadows, as if it had never been there at all. I stood there for a moment, too stunned to move, before my survival instincts kicked in, and I turned and bolted back down the trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted through the woods. I didn't stop running until I was back at my car, my hands trembling so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. I peeled out of the parking lot and didn't stop driving until I was safely back in town, the lights of Cedar Hollow fading in the rearview mirror. I never went back to those woods after that night. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. I knew they wouldn't believe me, and even if they did, what could they do? No one would want to go looking for something like that. But I've never forgotten what happened in Cedar Hollow. The memory of those glowing eyes and that snarling face still haunts me, and I can't shake the feeling that the creature is still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. So if you ever find yourself in those woods, be careful, because you never know what might be watching you from the darkness. It was a Tuesday night, nothing particularly remarkable about it. The small town of Crescent Hollow was quiet as usual. Most folks tucked in for the night by 10. The only sounds were the occasional bark of a dog or the distant rumble of a passing truck on the highway. I had just settled into bed, a thick blanket pulled up to my chin, trying to shake off the lingering chill from the autumn air. My wife, Helen, had already fallen asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady. We'd lived in this town for nearly 5 years, having moved from the city in search of peace and quiet, and for the most part, we'd found it. Life was simple here, uneventful, just the way we liked it. That night, though, something felt different. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a nagging feeling, like the air was charged with something unseen. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes and willing myself to sleep, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, the phone rang. I jolted awake, heart racing, as the shrill sound cut through the silence. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it. Who would be calling at this hour? But then it rang again, and I realized it wasn't a dream. I glanced at the clock on the knitstand. 12:13 a.m. I hesitated. I didn't sleep much after that, lying awake, listening to every creak and groan of the house, every rustle of the wind outside. I kept expecting the phone to ring again, but it didn't. The rest of the night passed in agonizing slowness, and by the time the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I was exhausted. Ellen noticed something was off at breakfast. "You okay, Jack? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile, not wanting to worry her. Just didn't sleep well, that's all. Probably something I ate. She gave me a concerned look, but didn't press the issue, and I was grateful for that. I spent the day at work trying to shake off the unease from the night before, but it clung to me like a shadow, refusing to let go. The day dragged on, and by the time I got home I was ready to collapse. But that night, just as I was finally beginning to relax, the phone rang again. I nearly jumped out of my skin, the memory of the previous night's call still fresh in my mind. I picked up the phone, dreading what I might hear. "Hello?" This time there was no static, no ominous whisper. Instead, there was a long, drawn-out silence, and then, just as I was about to hang up, a voice spoke, different from the night before, but no less unsettling. "They're coming," it said, barely louder than a breath. My heart skipped a beat. Who's coming? Who is this? But once again the line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone in disbelief. I didn't know what to do. Who to call the police? What would I even tell them? That some stranger was calling me in the middle of the night with cryptic warnings. They'd think I was crazy. The next day passed in a blur. I tried to keep busy to distract myself, but the calls weighed on my mind. I didn't tell Ellen. She'd worry, and I didn't want to burden her with something I couldn't even explain. But as the sun began to set, my anxiety grew. I dreaded the night, dreaded the thought of that phone ringing again. I decided to stay up, too on edge to sleep, pacing the living room, glancing nervously at the phone. Midnight came and went, and for a brief moment I began to think that maybe it was over, that whoever had been calling had given up. But then, just as I was starting to let my guard down, the phone rang. I froze, the sound piercing through the quiet house like a knife. My hands were shaking as I picked up the receiver. "Hello?" My voice was barely above a whisper. There was a pause, and then the voice came again, the same one from the first night. "You should have laughed when you had the chance." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" But the line went dead, just like before. I slammed the phone down, a wave of anger and fear washing over me. This had to stop. I wasn't going to be terrorized in my own home by some anonymous caller. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the phone, waiting for it to ring again, but it didn't. The hours dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last, until finally the first light of dawn began to break through the curtains. Exhausted, I made up my mind I was going to the police. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy. Something was going on, and I needed help. I didn't tell Ellen where I was going, just that I had some errands to run. She was still half asleep when I left, so I doubt she even noticed how on edge I was. The drive to the police station was a blur. I kept replaying the calls in my head, trying to make sense of them, but it was like trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. When I finally arrived, I was a wreck, tired, anxious, and desperate for answers. I explained the situation to the officer at the front desk, trying to stay calm and rational, but I could tell he didn't take me seriously. He humored me, though, jotting down some notes and asking a few questions, but I could see it in his eyes. He thought I was just some paranoid guy who'd let his imagination run wild. "Look," he said finally, leaning back in his chair, "we'll keep an eye out, but it's probably just some kids messing around. If the calls keep coming, maybe change your number or get an unlisted one." I left the station feeling worse than when I'd arrived. I'd hoped for some reassurance, some explanation, but instead I'd been dismissed. I drove around aimlessly for a while, not ready to go home, not ready to face another night. When I finally did return, Ellen was waiting for me, concern etched on her face. "Where have you been?" "I've been worried sick." I forced a smile, trying to hide the turmoil inside. "Just had some things to take care of. Everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. That night the phone rang again, right on schedule. This time I didn't answer. I couldn't. The sound of the ringing echoed in the house, filling me with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. It rang, and then it stopped, only to start up again moments later. Ellen woke up, groggy and confused. "Who's calling at this hour?" I shook my head, unable to speak, my heart pounding in my chest. She reached for the phone, but I stopped her, my hand gripping her wrist. "Don't," I whispered. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Jack, what's going on? Who's calling?" I didn't know what to tell her. I couldn't explain it. Couldn't make her understand the terror that had taken hold of me. It's no one. Just let it ring." The phone eventually stopped ringing, and the silence that followed was almost worse. Ellen was clearly shaken, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. I didn't want her to share in my fear, didn't want her to be dragged into whatever this was. The next few nights were the same. The phone would ring right around midnight, but I never answered. Ellen tried to ask me about it, but I brushed her off, telling her it was just a wrong number, a prank call, anything to keep her from worrying. But the truth was I was terrified the calls weren't stopping, and I had no idea who was behind them or what they wanted. Then, one night, the calls stopped. It was a relief, at first, but as the days passed and the phone remained silent, I started to feel a different kind of fear, one that was even worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something inevitable, and the silence was just the calm before the storm. I started to notice things, small, subtle changes in the house, in the way the shadows fell, and the way the air felt heavier, thicker. Ellen noticed it, too, though she didn't say anything, just gave me these worried looks when she thought I wasn't paying attention. And then, one night, it happened. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood. I froze, listening, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It was coming from downstairs, near the front door. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Ellen, and crept down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching continued, faint but persistent, and as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I realized it was coming from the other side of the door. I stood there, my hand hovering over the doorknob, every instinct screaming at me not to open it. But I had to know. I had to see. I slowly turned the knob, the door creaking open, and stepped outside. The night was still, the air cold against my skin, but there was nothing there, just the empty front porch and the dark yard beyond. I stepped out onto the porch, my eyes scanning the shadows, looking for anything out of place. And then I saw a figure standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and twisted, its face obscured in shadow. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. As it took a step forward, its eyes, if they were eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The figure took another step, and then another, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. It stopped at the base of the porch steps, its head tilting slightly as it regarded me, and then it spoke, its voice low and hollow, like the wind through dead trees. "You should have left when you had the chance. I don't remember what happened next. All I know is that I woke up in the hospital with Ellen sitting beside me, her eyes red from crying. The doctors told me I'd had a panic attack, that I'd been found passed out on the front porch. They said I was lucky I hadn't hit my head when I fell, that I just needed to rest and take it easy for a while. But I knew the truth. I knew that whatever I'd seen that night, it wasn't just in my head. It was real, and it was out there, waiting. We left Crescent Hollow the next day, packed up everything we could fit into the car and drove until we were miles away from that town, from that house. We never looked back, never spoke of what happened, but I know we're not safe. No matter where we go, no matter how far we run, it will find us, because it's not just a place, not just a thing. It's a part of the darkness, a part of the night, and it will follow us wherever we go. So if you ever get a call in the middle of the night, and there's no one on the other end, hang up. Don't listen, don't speak, and whatever you do, don't open the door, because once you've let it in, there's no escaping it. No matter how far you run, no matter how well you hide, it will find you. And when it does, you'll wish you'd never answered the phone." The old mill by the river was a place of mystery and superstition in our small town. Blackwater Mill, they called it, and it had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. No one really knew why it had shut down. Some said it was due to the river drying up one summer. Others whispered of something far darker, a curse that had plagued the workers, driving them mad one by one. But those were just stories, passed down through generations, and I had never given them much thought until I found myself standing at its rusted gates one overcast afternoon. I had taken up photography as a hobby, and the mill seemed like the perfect subject. The decaying structure, overgrown with ivy and shrouded in a perpetual gloom, had an eerie beauty that I couldn't resist. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood as I made my way through the overgrown path leading to the entrance. The place was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It felt as if the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only me and the mill in a forgotten pocket of time. But as I approached the entrance, I noticed a strange symbol carved into the wooden door, a circle with jagged lines radiating from its center. It was weathered and barely visible, but there was something about it that sent a shiver down my spine. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior was dark, the air stale and heavy with dust. I could barely make out the remnants of old machinery, rusted and covered in cobwebs, their purpose long forgotten. The floor creaked under my weight as I stepped inside, the sound echoing through the empty space. I began taking photos, the flash of my camera briefly illuminating the gloom. The place had an unsettling atmosphere, a sense of something lingering just out of sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But there was no one here. The mill was empty, abandoned just as it had been for decades. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept wandering, drawn back to the strange symbol on the door. It felt familiar, like something I had seen before but couldn't quite place. As I moved deeper into the mill, the air grew colder, and the light from the windows dimmed, as if the day itself was fading. I reached a large room at the heart of the building, where the machinery was more intact. Massive gears and cogs, frozen in time, loomed over me, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. I set up my camera on a tripod, determined to capture the haunting beauty of this forgotten place. It was then that I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking on the walls from the inside. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The sound was coming from somewhere above me, from the upper floors that I had yet to explore. I waited, holding my breath, but the tapping continued, steady and relentless. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe some animal that had made its home in the old building. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I packed up my camera and made my way to the stairs, the old wooden steps creaking loudly under my weight. The upper floor was even darker than the one below, and the air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. The tapping grew louder as I reached the top of the stairs, reverberating through the floorboards. I followed the sound down a long, narrow hallway, the walls lined with old, decaying doors that led to rooms I didn't dare enter. At the end of the hallway, I found the source of the noise, a small door, slightly ajar, with the strange symbol carved into it. My pulse quickened as I reached for the handle, the tapping now a deafening roar in my ears. I hesitated, my hand trembling, but something compelled me to open the door. The room beyond was small and cramped, filled with old furniture and crates, and the tapping stopped as soon as I stepped inside. The silence was oppressive, the air thick with an unnameable dread. In the center of the room, I saw a large, dust-covered mirror, its surface cracked and smeared with grime. There was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl, but I couldn't look away. As I stared into the mirror, I saw movement, a flicker of shadow that wasn't mine. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and wiped away the grime with my sleeve. What I saw in the mirror wasn't my reflection. It was the room just as it was, but with one difference: there was someone standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty room. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. It had to be a trick of the light, a reflection of something outside the room, but I knew that wasn't true. The figure had been real as the cold sweat that now clung to my skin. I turned back to the mirror, hoping to see something, anything that would explain what was happening. But the figure was gone, leaving only my own terrified face staring back at me. I wanted to leave, to get out of that place, and never look back, but something held me there, rooted to the spot. I reached out to touch the mirror, my hand trembling, and as my fingers brushed the glass, I felt a sudden, intense cold, as if the mirror itself was freezing my skin. I pulled my hand back, gasping, and that's when I noticed the symbol, the same one that was carved into the door, etched into the glass, right where my hand had been. It glowed faintly, pulsing with an eerie light that seemed to come from within the mirror. I stepped back, fear gripping me, but before I could move, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. I was trapped. Panic set in as I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on me, and the air grew colder with each passing second. The mirror pulsed with light, the symbol burning brighter and brighter, until it was almost blinding. And then I heard a voice, low and whispering, coming from the mirror itself. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, the words sending a chill down my spine. "You've awakened something that should have stayed buried." I backed away from the mirror, my heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The room was spinning, the walls warping and twisting around me. The voice grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a sense of impending doom. "You are cursed," it hissed. Just like the others, I don't know how long I was in that room, but it felt like an eternity. The voice kept whispering, the light from the mirror growing brighter and brighter, until it filled the entire room, blinding me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The light vanished, The voice fell silent, and the door creaked open on its own. I stumbled out of the room, dazed and disoriented, my mind reeling from what had just happened. The hallway was as dark and silent as before, but I could feel something different in the air, something malevolent, as if the mill itself was watching me. I ran down the stairs, not caring about the noise, not caring about anything except getting out of that place. When I finally made it outside, the fresh air hit me like a wave, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The sun had set, and the world was bathed in the pale light of the moon. I don't remember how long I sat there just trying to collect myself, trying to make sense of what had happened, but there was no making sense of it. The only thing I knew for sure was that I had to leave, had to get as far away from Blackwater Mill as possible. I never went back to that place, never even spoke of it to anyone, but the curse, whatever was, followed me. I started seeing things, shadows out of the corner of my strange symbols etched into my walls, my furniture, even my skin. The voice returned, whispering in my ear at night, reminding me of the curse I had brought upon myself. I don't know how much longer I can take it. The curse is spreading, consuming me piece by piece. I've tried to break it, tried to find a way to undo what I've done, but it's too late. The curse is part of me now, a dark shadow that I can't escape, and I know that one day it will claim me, just as it claimed the others. So if you ever find yourself near Blackwater Mill, do yourself a favor and stay away. Don't go inside. Don't awaken the curse that lies within, because once you've been marked, there's no going back. The curse will find you, no matter where you go, no matter how far you run. It's only a matter of time before it consumes you, just like it's consuming me. There's a stretch of woods just outside of our small town that folks around here call Midwood Forest. It's not the kind of place people go for a casual hike or a weekend camping trip. Most steer clear of it altogether, and those who do venture in usually don't go very far. The forest is dense, with trees so tall and thick that they block out most of the sunlight, leaving the ground below in a perpetual state of twilight. I wasn't one to buy into local legends or old wives' tales. I'd always figured the stories about Midwood were just that, stories. But when I was younger, probably around 21, I had a bit of a reckless streak. I didn't believe in all that nonsense about cursed woods or strange creatures lurking in the dark. So one weekend, when I found myself with nothing to do, I decided to head out to Midwood and see what all the fuss was about. It was late afternoon when I arrived, the sun already beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt road leading into the forest. I parked my truck at the edge of the tree line and grabbed my backpack, loaded with the usual gear: water, snacks, a flashlight, and a hunting knife that I kept more for peace of mind than anything else. I wasn't planning to stay out long, just a few hours to satisfy my curiosity. The first thing that struck me as I entered the forest was how quiet it was. No birds chirping, no rustling of leaves in the breeze, just an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the stories get to me. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the unease in my gut only grew stronger. The trail I was following was barely more than a narrow path through the underbrush, winding its way deeper into the heart of Midwood. I'd been walking for about an hour when I noticed something strange. The trees around me, which had been fairly evenly spaced, were now growing closer together, their twisted branches intertwining above my head to form a canopy so thick that it blotted out the sky. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the light had taken on an odd, dim quality that made it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. That's when I heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush somewhere behind me. At first I thought it might be another hiker, someone who had decided to take the same trail. But when I stopped to listen, the footsteps stopped too. I turned around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just that same oppressive silence. I shook my head, trying to shrug off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. It was probably just an animal, I told myself, a deer, maybe, or a fox. But as I continued down the trail, the footsteps started up again, closer this time. I quickened my pace, my heart beginning to race as I tried to convince myself that there was nothing to worry about. But then the footsteps started to match my pace, speeding up when I did, slowing down when I slowed down. It was as if something was following me, something that knew exactly what it was doing. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel a presence just beyond the edge of my vision, lurking in the shadows. I picked up my pace, walking as quickly as I could without breaking into a full-on run. The footsteps followed, relentless, never missing a beat. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but deep down I knew there wasn't one. Whatever was following me wasn't human. It couldn't be. The trail ahead of me was getting narrower, the trees pressing in on either side until there was barely enough room to squeeze through. My breathing was coming in short, panicked gasps, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back as I pushed through the underbrush. The footsteps were louder now, almost right behind me, and I could feel the presence closing in, suffocating me with its intensity. I had to get out of there. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get away from whatever was following me. I veered off the path, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping against my face as I ran. The footsteps didn't falter, didn't hesitate for a second. They followed me, relentless, as if they were part of the forest itself. I don't know how long I ran, but it felt like an eternity. My lungs were burning. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I didn't dare stop. The trees around me were a blur, and the dim light had faded to almost complete darkness, but I kept running, driven by sheer terror. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. I stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I stood there in the dark, listening, waiting for the footsteps to start up again, but there was nothing, just silence. The presence was gone, as if it had never been there at all. I stood there for a long time, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had just happened. But the only thing I knew for sure was that I needed to get out of those woods. I didn't care how far I'd run off the trail. I just needed to find my way back to the truck and get the hell out of MIDWOD. It took me hours to find my way back, stumbling through the darkness, my flashlight barely cutting through the thick gloom. By the time I finally saw the faint glow of the parking lot lights through the trees, I was half delirious with exhaustion and fear. I didn't stop running until I reached the truck, and even then my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the key into the ignition. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. I knew they wouldn't believe me. They'd just say it was a trick of the light, or that I had let my imagination get the better of me. But I know what I experienced in Midwood Forest was real. Something was out there, something that wasn't human, something that had been stalking me through those dark, twisted woods, and I'm not the only one. Since that night, I've heard stories from others, people who ventured into Midwood and come out with the same haunted look in their eyes, people who've heard the footsteps and felt the presence following them, just like I did. We don't talk about it much. We know better than to go spreading tales that no one will believe. But we all know the truth. There's something out there in Midwood Forest, something that watches and waits, something that follows you when you think you're alone. So if you ever find yourself near Midwood, do yourself a favor and stay away. Don't go looking for whatever's out there in those dark woods, because you might just find it. And if you do, you might not make it out alive. I've lived in the northern woods of Michigan my whole life. It's a quiet place, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of city life, surrounded by miles of dense forest. My nearest neighbor is about half a mile down the road, and the closest town is a good 20-minute drive. I like the solitude. It gives me time to think, to breathe, to just be. But that solitude can turn into something else entirely when the sun goes down and the forest takes on a life of its own. I'd heard the stories about the dogmen growing up. Everyone around here has. It's part of the local folklore, something the old-timers like to bring up around a campfire or over a couple of beers. They'd talk about this creature half-man, half-wolf that roams the woods at night, its eyes glowing in the dark, its howls echoing through the trees. But like most folks, I never really believed in it. I figure it was just something parents told their kids to keep them from wandering too far into the woods at night. But then came the night that changed everything. It was early autumn, and the days were getting shorter. The air had that crisp, cool bite to it that signaled the coming of winter. I'd spent the day working on my truck, trying to get it ready for the cold months ahead. By the time I was done, the sun had already set, and the forest around me was cloaked in darkness. I wiped my hands on a rag, tossed it onto the workbench, and headed inside for some dinner. I'd just finished eating when I heard the first sound, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere outside. I froze, listening. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but it was there. I walked over to the window and peered out into the darkness, but all I could see was the faint outline of the trees against the night sky. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably just a coyote or a raccoon rummaging around. I went back to my chair, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut, but the growling didn't stop. It got louder, closer, until it sounded like it was right outside my door. I grabbed my shotgun, the one I keep loaded and ready just in case, and slowly made my way to the front door. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had to take a deep breath to steady my hands. I opened the door just a crack, enough to see out onto the porch, but there was nothing there, just the dark, empty yard. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, something moving at the edge of the tree line, too far away to make out clearly. But as it stepped into the faint light cast by the porch, I felt my blood run cold. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, with a broad, muscular bill covered in thick, dark fur. Its head was that of a wolf with a long snout and sharp, pointed ears, but its body was almost human, standing on 2 legs, its arms hanging at its sides, each ending in long, clawed hands. But it was the eyes that taught me the way they glowed in the darkness, a deep, burning yellow that seemed to pierce right through me. Those eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was like time had stopped, and all I could do was stare into those eyes, feeling the sheer, primal terror that they brought with them. The creature took a step toward the house, and I snapped out of my trance. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely turn the deadbolt. I backed away from the door, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything to protect myself. I ran to the living room, grabbing the phone to call the sheriff. But when I put it to my ear, there was nothing, no dial tone, just dead silence. I cursed under my breath, tossing the phone aside. I wasn't about to sit there and wait for that thing to break down my door. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the back, heading for the truck parked in the driveway. My plan was to get to the town, find help, and figure out what the hell was going on. But as I rounded the corner of the house, I skidded to a stop. The creature was standing in the driveway right next to the truck, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It hadn't made a sound, no growl, no howl, nothing. It was just standing there, watching me, like it was waiting for something. My shotgun was still in my hand, but I knew it wouldn't do much against something like that. I'd heard the stories bullets don't stop the dogman. I slowly backed up, trying to put some distance between us. The creature didn't move, didn't make any sign that it was going to attack. It just watched me, those yellow eyes tracking my every move. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do, where to go. I couldn't get to the truck, and running back into the house seemed like a death sentence. Then, as if it had decided I wasn't worth its time, the creature turned and walked back into the woods. It moved with an eerie grace, its long limbs carrying it silently into the trees. I stood there, frozen, watching as it disappeared into the darkness. The only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears and the rustling of the leaves as the creature vanished into the night. I didn't sleep at all that night. I locked every door, every window, and sat in the living room with the shotgun across my lap, waiting for it to come back, but it never did. The rest of the night passed in a tense, uneasy silence, and when the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I haven't seen the dogman since that night, but I know it's still out there, somewhere in those woods. I don't go out after dark anymore, and I keep my shotgun loaded and within arm's reach at all times. The locals don't talk about the dogman much, but I know they believe in it just like I do now. It's not just a story, it's real, and it's out there, waiting in the shadows. But so if you ever find yourself in the northern woods of Michigan, remember this: don't go out after dark, don't wander too far from the safety of your home, and if you ever see a pair of glowing yellow eyes watching you from the darkness, run. Run and don't look back, because once the dogman finds you, there's no telling if you'll make it out alive. The pines stretched tall and menacing around our small town, their dark silhouettes forming an unbroken line that marked the edge of civilization. Everyone knew to stay clear of them, especially after dusk. It wasn't just the wild animals that made them dangerous. It was the stories, passed down from generation to generation, about the voices in the woods. They said the pines could talk, that they whispered to those who wandered to close, luring them in, never to be seen again. But those were just tales to scare children, or so I thought, until the day I heard the whispers myself. It started as an ordinary day. I had decided to take a walk through the woods, ignoring the warnings, eager to capture the beauty of the late autumn colors with my camera. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the trees, and the air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine needles. I had always loved the woods, the way they made me feel so small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things. There was something peaceful about being surrounded by nature, away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the light began to fade, the sun dipping below the horizon, and the shadows grew longer, more defined. The pines closed in around me, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out what little light was left. I should have turned back then, but something urged me to keep going, a strange compulsion that I couldn't explain. It was as if the forest was calling to me, drawing me in with an invisible force. I had been walking for nearly an hour when I heard it, the faintest whisper, barely audible over the rustling of leaves. I stopped in my tracks, listening, but the sound was gone, replaced by the eerie silence of the woods at night. I shook it off as my imagination, a trick of the wind, and continued on my way. But the whisper came again, this time clearer, as if someone was standing just behind me. Murmuring words I couldn't understand, I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. The trees stood tall and silent, their trunks dark and foreboding. I was alone, or so it seemed. The whisper came again, and this time I could make out words, though they were faint and distorted, like a radio signal barely within range. "Come closer," the voice said, soft and almost pleading. "Come closer." A chill ran down my spine, but I found myself taking a step forward, then another, as if the voice was pulling me along. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to turn back, to run as fast as I could, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know where the voice was coming from, what it wanted. The deeper I went into the woods, the louder the whisper became, though it still seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The trees closed in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the ground beneath my feet grew soft and spongy, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow me whole. I stumbled over roots and fallen branches, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Closer," the voice urged, more insistent now. Just a little closer. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, a sickening dread settling in my stomach. The air was thick and oppressive, filled with the scent of decay, and the darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides. I was lost, completely disoriented, with no sense of direction. The path I had been following was gone, swallowed by the forest, and I had no idea how to find my way back. Panic began to set in as I realized just how deep into the woods I had wandered. The whispers were all around me now, growing louder, more urgent, as if they were trying to drown out my thoughts. I tried to block them out, to focus on finding a way out, but the voices wouldn't let me. They burrowed into my mind, twisting and warping my thoughts until I could barely think straight. "Don't leave," the voice pleaded, a note of desperation creeping into its tone. "Please, don't leave." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear, as the whispers grew louder and louder, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable anger, hatred, a deep, seething malice that sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way, and I fell, tumbling down a steep slope into a ravine. The world spun around me, and I landed hard on the forest floor. The wind knocked out of me. I lay there, dazed and disoriented, trying to catch my breath. The whispers had stopped, replaced by the deafening silence of the woods. I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning, and looked around. The ravine was narrow and deep, the walls lined with twisted roots and jagged rocks. There was no way I could climb back up. I was trapped with no way out, and the realization sent a wave of panic through me. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the darkness at the far end of the ravine. My blood ran cold as I strained to see who or what was there, but the shadows were too thick, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just a few feet away from me. I could feel the presence, something dark and malevolent, standing just out of sight. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the dim light. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The presence moved closer, the air around me growing colder still, until it was standing right in front of me. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness. I could just make out the glint of its eyes, glowing faintly in the gloom. It reached out a hand, long and bony, the skin stretched tight over the bones, and touched my face. The touch was like ice, sending a jolt of pain through my entire body. I tried to pull away, but the figure held me in place, its grip unyielding. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, as if they were trying to warn me. But it was too late. The figure leaned in close, its breath cold against my skin, and whispered in my ear, "You belong to us now," it said, its voice a raspy, guttural growl. I felt a searing pain in my chest, as if something was being ripped out of me, and I screamed, the sound echoing through the ravine. The figure's grip tightened, and I could feel the life draining out of me, my vision growing dim. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure's eyes, glowing with a terrible, malevolent light. When I woke up, I was lying at the edge of the woods, the morning sun filtering through the trees. My body ached, and I could barely move, but I was alive. I had no memory of how I had gotten there, no recollection of anything after the figure had touched me. But I knew, deep down, that something had changed. I could feel it, a darkness lurking inside me, something that hadn't been there before. I never went back to the pines after that. I stayed as far away from the woods as possible, but it didn't matter. The whispers followed me, haunting my every step, filling my dreams with nightmares. The figure was always there, standing in the shadows, waiting for me, and I knew that one day it would come for me again. The pines had marked me, claimed me as their own, and there was no escaping their grasp. I could run, I could hide, but the whispers would always find me, and when they did, there would be no escaping the darkness that had taken root inside me. I'd always considered myself an experienced hiker. I'd spent countless weekends and holidays exploring the trails and backwoods of the Midwest, from the gentle hills of the Appalachian foothills to the rugged cliffs of the Ozarks. There was something about being out in the wilderness that made me feel alive, far away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. But even the most seasoned hikers can find themselves unprepared for what lurks in the shadows of the forest. It was late October, just a few days before Halloween, when I decided to take a solo trip to the Manistee National Forest in Michigan. The weather was perfect for hiking, cool and crisp, with the leaves just beginning to change color. I packed my gear, made sure I had plenty of supplies, and set out on a trail that I'd heard was particularly beautiful this time of year. The plan was to hike a loop that would take me deep into the forest, camp overnight, and return to my car the next morning. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. I followed the trail as it wound through dense stands of pine and hardwood, the sound of crunching leaves underfoot the only noise in the stillness of the woods. I'd made good time and decided to set up camp near a small clearing I found just off the trail. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, and I wanted to have everything ready before darkness fell. I built a small fire, cooked myself a quick meal, and settled in for what I expected to be a peaceful night under the stars. But as the last light of day faded and the forest around me grew dark, I began to feel a creeping sense of unease. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a vague, unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. After all, I was miles from the nearest road or house, alone in the wilderness, with nothing but my thoughts for company. But as the night wore on, that feeling of unease grew stronger until it was impossible to ignore. It started with the sounds. At first, it was just the usual noises of the forest at night, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, the distant hoot of an owl. But then I began to hear something else, something that didn't belong. It was a low, rumbling growl, so faint that I almost missed it. I stopped what I was doing, straining my ears to listen, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind, or maybe a distant animal that was no threat to me. But then I heard it again, closer this time, a deep, guttural growl that sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it around the clearing, the beam cutting through the darkness as I searched for the source of the noise. But there was nothing there, just the empty forest and the flickering light of my dying campfire. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest as I listened to the silence. And then I saw it, a pair of glowing yellow eyes, watching me from the shadows just beyond the reach of my flashlight. They were too high off the ground to belong to any ordinary animal, too bright to be anything natural. Those eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and I could feel the weight of that gaze like a physical force. I backed away slowly, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the hunting knife I always kept on me during these trips. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no explanation that made sense. I'd heard the stories. Of course, everyone around here had. The locals called it the dogman, a creature that was half man, half elf, stalking the woods of northern Michigan. But those were just stories, right? I didn't have time to think about it. The creature stepped out of the shadows, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It was massive, standing at least 7 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur that glistened in the light of my flashlight. Its head was that of a wolf with sharp, pointed ears and a long snout full of razor-sharp teeth. But its body was almost human, with broad shoulders, long, muscular arms, and legs that ended in clawed feet. It let out a low growl, the sound rumbling through the clearing like distant thunder. I took another step back, my mind screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But my legs felt like they were made of lead, and I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature that was slowly advancing toward me. And then, just as I thought it was going to lunge at me, the creature stopped. It tilted its head to the side, as if considering me, those glowing eyes narrowing slightly. I don't know what it saw or why it hesitated, but in that moment I found the strength to move. I turned and ran, sprinting through the trees as fast as my legs would carry me, the sounds of the forest a blur around me. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, the breath burning in my lungs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the door open and throwing myself inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and tore out of there as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I don't know how long I drove before I finally pulled over on the side of the road, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely hold the steering wheel. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, that I hadn't really seen what I thought I'd seen. But I knew better. I haven't been back to the Manistee National Forest since that night. I've given up hiking altogether. In fact, the woods, which once felt like a sanctuary to me, now feel like a place of danger, of unknown horrors lurking just out of sight. I don't tell people about what happened. I doubt anyone would believe me if I did. But I know what I saw, and I know that it's out there, somewhere in those dark woods, waiting. So if you ever find yourself hiking in the northern woods of Michigan, especially at night, keep your wits about you. Stay on the trails, don't stray too far from safety, and if you hear a low growl or see a pair of glowing yellow eyes in the darkness, run. Run and don't stop, because once the dogman finds you, there's no telling if you'll make it out alive.